Fantastic, and welcome to today's WebF webinar. And we've got a really amazing lineup of speakers today on a very important subject area. It's on the transformation of land use and helping to deliver a vibrant, sustainable economy. My name is James Kavanagh. I'm a Chartered Surveyor and Chartered Geographer, and I'm the Head of Land and Resources at RICS. And this webinar is going to particularly look at the use and ownership of land and the fundamental impacts this will have on society and the economy as we look to build over the coming decades, and particularly around tackling climate change. We're going to have leading experts in the wake of COP27 and much that came out of that. And of course on the UK, a particular focus looking at several of the initiatives that are ongoing, particularly the Scottish Land Commission, the Geospatial Commission and various land futures documentation that's come out over the last few years. Land use has never been higher up the policy and legislative agenda, and particularly now as we move towards move away from a carbon fuel-based economy towards something more approaching sustainability and net zero. There's a lot going on within this space, a hell of a lot going on, and RICS is trying to keep up with all of this, particularly as we try to achieve net zero, land ownership issues, renewable energy coming back on shore again after much toing and froing, agroecology and soil issues rewilding, social justice, change in government policy, and the forthcoming House of Lords Committee report. And of course, not forgetting the biodiversity net gain, housing, and all those other pressures that are coming on land use over the next few years. It means that we really need to be careful and more intelligent about how we use this finite resource. Like I said, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. With presentations, two of them, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so do please put your questions into the chat box and we'll deal with them as we go along. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Louise Heathwaite, CBE, who's a Commissioner on the National Land Data Programme and of course a professor and well-known academic in the land use circles at Lancaster University. Okay, Louise, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and delighted to be here at this really important meeting. I think, you know, where I start from, in a sense, is that we want an awful lot from our land, and that demands on land seems to be increasing almost daily, in a sense. So, you know, just reflecting on the things we're trying to achieve: net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We want to build more houses. We want to maintain food production levels. We want to deliver over 600 billion of infrastructure investment, identify sites for green infrastructure or green energy, and protect 30% of our land for nature. I don't know how we're going to achieve that, but I do know that by talking about that, we need to reflect on some of the challenges more carefully. And there's lots of work going on that can help us in including the work from the Geospatial Commission, which is where I'm coming from today. So could I have next slide, please? So for my sins, it was 12 years ago now, I was part of a big programme of work called the Land Use Futures Programme that was led by GoScience. You're not expected to be able to read this picture at all, but I use it quite a lot because it reflects just some of the complexity of the land use system and the interconnectivity of it. And very much the approach we're taking at the Geospatial Commission is to try and understand just where in that complexity the Commission can add value, where the friction points are that we can perhaps unravel some of the stickiness in the system and help things move forward in a way. So that systems approach and that way of thinking about it is really quite important. A lot of people, when they saw this sort of spaghetti diagram, just went, I can't cope with that. But actually it's a way of trying to reflect on, if you make a decision in one part of the system, it will have an impact on others, and therefore anything we think about in that context needs to understand that. Next slide, please. So where does the Geospatial come in? So here's a bit of background on the Commission. It's an independent expert group. It sets UK geospatial strategy and has an important role in coordinating activity and is part of the Cabinet Office. Next slide, please. So I think this slide is quite helpful in terms of just making clear to people who perhaps are not aware of what the Commission does in terms of where it's focused. So here you've got identify the 4 key missions, and you can see, you know, some of them range from protection and safeguarding, some of them cover around improving quality of data. But I think the one that's really important for me is, you know, how we enhance capabilities and skills and awareness, and particularly mission 4, how we enable innovation, because that's one of the ways we can move from where we were to where we are. So the spaghetti diagram I showed you from about 2010, we have moved an awful long way in terms of the understanding, and you'll hear from some of the other speakers today about just how far we've moved in terms of addressing some of those issues. But I think, you know, what you've got here in this geospatial strategy as spelled out is something that's really, really bold in terms of trying to get to grips with some of those strategies from a geospatial, some of the elements from a geospatial perspective. Next slide, please. So location data opportunities more generally. This is why I say the Geospatial Commission is being so, you know, bold in terms of what it's doing. So just look at all the things that have been that we're trying to pull together here in terms of the sort of focus. So I think that why that's so important is that rather than focusing on just one aspect, which tends to be where perhaps government departments do focus and have to focus to address their needs, we're actually trying to pull these together in some sort of comprehensive focus in a sense. So that brings me on to the next slide, which is a bit about data. Next slide, please. So again, this is like teaching grandma to suck eggs. You will all know the values that are spelled out here. The importance of land to the UK and the challenge of the very many multiple focuses that are in there. But I think the second bullet point down here is one that's really important and is coming out as a consequence of some of the activities that we're doing to try and pull this together. And that is in the sense of, you know, the way that modelling or spatial modelling can play a crucial role. Now, modelling is a term that, you know, to myself as an academic, you have to use quite carefully. In the context that it's used here, it's used, it's not quite loosely, but it's a little bit around that, in the sense that the point really is that there is no single model that one can identify that will account for the challenges around land use and land management opportunities. It depends very much on what the question's being asked and who's asking the question. So the challenge for us as the Geospatial Commission is thinking how we take the best bits of those models and reflect on where those points that I described earlier are, the friction points, how we can unravel stickiness in the system, add value, maybe make data more available, enhance conversations, all sorts of things to actually help us move on in a sense. And the third bullet here describes some of the sort of broad areas that we're starting to develop on in terms of various projects to look at those pressures and the sort of innovation that we need in terms of data to help us get that sort of integrated spatial modelling in a better place, so that we can actually understand some of the trade-offs for decisions made in one area and then the impact on others. Next slide, please. So some of the key projects that are involved in that, and you just need to look at the website to maybe have a look at a bit more data around here. But two critical areas I think are really, really helpful is a relatively recent initiative around land use dialogues. So actually, and for enabling those conversations about key policy requirements for land use and how we can actually adapt those going forward. What are the key things we need to understand? Can we actually explore what the issues are? And that dialogue part is really, really important in terms of actually approaching things on the way forward. And then the second point is, again, involvement with regional pilots. And there are people around this table who are virtual table who've been heavily involved in helping us deliver those, in the sense of, well, let's actually try out what we're thinking about in particular areas to gain a better understanding of some of the challenges. Where the Geospatial Commission is going with this is that we'll publish a policy report, but that won't be till autumn 2023. What that basically says, I should say to you, is that there's a lot of opportunities to engage, but there are also quite a lot of work to do before we get to that stage in terms of how to put these things forward. But it's really, the underpinning is that if we support the concept of a national land use framework, how can spatial data support the delivery of that framework, enable it to happen in a way that actually is lasting, rather than having to repeat work that might have been done again and again and again. I think I'm very keen that we actually add real value to other programs that are going on and help move things forward. Next slide, please. So that's where you can find out a bit more about the Geospatial Commission and the work that's been done, and obviously reach through to me if you've got any queries or questions that I failed to ask in the Q&A that will come on later. So thank you very much. That's me for now, and I guess we'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Louise. A really good intro there to some of the amazing work that the Geospatial Commission, and I suppose we're very enthused about the fact that it's really got its teeth into land use and land use information. All of those big six, the big organisations involved in the Geospatial Commission, Land Registry, Ordnance Survey, Valuation Office, Hydrographic Office, etc. They've got a lot to bring to the party on this type of information. I think that the land use dialogues has been a very kind of worthwhile piece as well, but we'll speak more about that in the Q&A when we hear from the others. Now, on this event today, we have over 180 people from 20 nations or so all around the world, but an area of particular interest, particularly around land use and very forward-thinking land changes to land use legislation has been Scotland. And I think we're very lucky today to have Hamish Trench from the Scottish Land Commission, who's going to tell us a bit more about what they've been doing up there and how they're really starting to kind of get to grips with sustainable land management and every issue from social justice to net zero. Okay, Hamish, over to you.
James, thank you, and really good to join you today. So Louise has set out kind of really clearly there the increasing demands that we are faced with on our land, and I'm just going to reflect a bit on how we're approaching this in Scotland at the moment. So a bit of introduction first to the Scottish Land Commission. We were set up in 2017, really to advise the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament on land reform policy, but more widely to stimulate fresh thinking on how we own and use land. And we do that by carrying out research and policy advice. But we also put a huge amount of emphasis on working directly with landowners, land managers and communities right around both rural and urban Scotland to stimulate change in practice and improvements in practice on the ground. And we also spend quite a bit of time with a more public-facing focus, engaging people in why land matters. And for this audience, I don't need to spell that out, I think, but just worth reflecting on. Our land obviously is a fundamental resource in terms of production for us in Scotland and the UK, but it's much more than that. It's central to local community identity, to national identity, to people's sense of place, and it's fundamental to our economy. In the UK, we have more than 50% of our wealth held in land. So are we using that wealth productively? So in the next slide, I'll just reflect on where we are in Scotland in terms of land reform so far. I could go back to the 1800s here. Scotland has a long kind of history of land reform and changes in our relationship with land. But in more recent times, in terms of devolved government within the UK, we've had 2 land reform acts over the last 2 decades, 2003 and 2016. We're on the 3rd iteration of a land use strategy that tries to set out and draw together a more integrated approach to managing Scotland's land and the competing demands on it. And these acts, the previous land reform acts in particular, have introduced community rights to buy. Land reform in Scotland has taken a route particularly of encouraging communities to own land and therefore widen and share the benefits from land via ownership. We also have a land rights and responsibilities statement, which is a statement approved by Parliament that sets out the relationship between people and land. And I'd also want to make the point that although we've had legislation, actually a lot of this is about culture change. And we have seen significant culture change in our approach to land and the public interest in land over the last 5 to 10 years. So the next slide just looks at what's coming up in land reform in Scotland. We are looking at a third land reform bill next year. The Scottish Government has recently consulted over the summer on the principles for the next land reform bill, which is due to be introduced to Parliament next year. And the central focus for that is on addressing Scotland's pattern of concentrated land ownership in a net zero context. So Scotland has a long history of wanting to address the pattern of land ownership, to create more diverse land ownership pattern, widen the access and benefits from land. And of course, we need to do that now in the context of a just transition to net zero. And I'll say a wee bit more later about some of what might be in the next bill. We have huge new drivers of change, net zero being the primary amongst them. And we also have new legislative opportunities over the next 2 years on agriculture and natural environment and community wealth building. So my point here is certainly for us in Scotland, we have a window of opportunity for some really joined up policy thinking here. So on the next slide, I just want to flag, are we in a decade of transformation? Talking about increasing land use pressures, and I listened into the launch this morning of the Climate Change Committee's report on Scottish progress in meeting our climate change targets, and it's crystal clear that the next decade needs to be one of transformation. For all these reasons on the slides and many more, we are seeing huge land use change around us at the moment. And the question I really want to raise from this is, how do we carry public support through this time of change? How do we maintain the social license for change in which people feel they are going to benefit from this process? The next slide just looks at the question of who's actually buying land in Scotland at the moment and why. And this is central in a way to some of the changes we're seeing. And I think to carrying public support through this period of change as well. We published some research earlier this year looking over the last couple of years, and last year, for example, half of all estates sold in Scotland were sold to corporates, investment funds or charitable trusts. That raises new questions about the connection between owners and land. More than half, 64% of these sales were off-market, again raising questions about transparency, access to the land market, ability for individuals, farmers, communities to be participating in the land market. So I think this pattern and what we're seeing at the moment raises whole new questions about the motivations for land ownership and the implications of new and changing patterns in ownership. And remember, this is in a context in which Scotland wants to produce a much more diverse pattern of ownership. But it's not, of course, just about who's buying land and who owns it. The next slide really asks who decides on big land use decisions. We are all making at the moment, collectively, some very big and very major land use decisions that have long-term consequences. We're locking up carbon rights, for example, for decades to come. We're making significant changes in afforestation. Scotland is looking to expand woodland cover by 18,000 hectares a year by 2018. Huge significant changes that will have big impacts for communities, for local economies, and for our national targets and objectives on net zero economy and communities. We already have in Scotland a really clear expectation that local communities should be engaged in big land use decisions. There's guidance in place, there's protocols in place, there's clarity in the land rights responsibility statement that big changes should involve meaningful community engagement to be able to influence those changes. That conversation is now moving on to community benefit. Not only the expectation that communities should be involved in the decision-making process and be able to influence that, but actually how are communities and importantly local economies benefiting from the kind of changes that we're seeing. And I think this is absolutely crucial in carrying public support, that where, for example, we're seeing significant land use change for net zero, some of the financial benefit and wider economic and social benefit needs to very demonstrably flow back into local communities and local economies, and certainly not be sort of extracted from the wider regional or Scottish economy. And the whole question of integration, how do we do this in a way that's joined up? So we're not just talking about carbon, we're talking about nature, community, economy, a whole wide range of benefits that people are wanting out of land use change. What are the institutional structures that we need to put in place to do that? We advised over the last about 3 years ago on the potential for regional land use partnerships in Scotland. The Scottish Government has since been piloting these in 5 areas across Scotland, really to test a more regional approach to bringing different interests together to create regional land use frameworks and create a regional land use partnership. And we see these as being absolutely central to the kind of solutions we need, not only to better join up decision making and data, but actually to create better accountability and better transparency in land use decision making. One of the big changes we're seeing at the moment, and the next slide focuses in on markets. One of the big changes we're seeing at the moment is the change in relation to investment for carbon and natural capital in Scotland, as indeed we are around the world, I think. We're not alone in this, but it raises some very significant questions of how we manage this and how we derive public benefit from this. The Scottish Government has set out this year interim principles for responsible investment in natural capital, and we worked with the government team in putting these together. And these set out, for example, expectations around the community benefit, community involvement, productive land ownership patterns. And I think there's some big questions about investment in carbon and natural capital. How do we do this in a way that actually channels money and finance through local economies and communities, rather than simply extracting that in a wider corporate market? But the recommendations that we made to Scottish Government back in June around this were essentially that we should be looking at shaping both the carbon and natural capital markets and, of course, the land market. And we can and should be shaping these in the public interest. And the bill, the next land reform bill that I mentioned, proposes, for example, that when large-scale areas of land change hands, they should be subject to a public interest test, which would introduce some safeguards at the point of transfer of large land holdings. Another very significant driver, of course, is tax and fiscal policy. Less immediate proposals, I think, from government on this at the moment, but it's notable, for example, that as the balance of public and private finance changes, particularly with new private finance coming into natural capital, the logical consequence, of course, is that public funding and support should change in response to that and be retargeted to where it's really needed. In the final slide, I'll just draw this together by flagging some of the opportunities that I think we can see at the moment. I've just talked about the opportunity in terms of regulation, effective regulation of the carbon and natural capital markets, as well as the land market. I would also flag the opportunity for much more imaginative ownership and governance models. In many ways, the UK and Scotland are quite unusual in a Northern European context in thinking about land ownership in a very binary way. We think it's either publicly owned or privately owned or community owned. Excuse me, I've gone and interrupted myself by having a timer there. Let me just ignore that. So huge scope for more imaginative ownership and governance models that bring together the public, private and community interests, perhaps in shared ownership structures, in different governance models, land use decision models. But also this is not about legislation. There's a huge opportunity here for leadership in different ownership sectors. And absolutely, we are here to encourage that and work with private sectors, public and NGO sectors in these opportunities. And I'll finish again by just the opportunity of regional scale land use planning. And I mentioned the regional land use partnerships. I'm also a huge fan of the work that Sue's team in the Food Farming Countryside Commission will be doing in the regional land use pilots, which is probably a good place for me to close and pass back to you, James, for our next one.
Many thanks, Hamish. Don't worry, I often interrupt myself. That's fine. Usually leave my phone off so someone calls me right in the middle of it. Thanks a lot for that. I think that's a very, very interesting things that we can talk about during the Q&A session, panel session there, particularly on that change of investment models within land. Like, very interesting that 50% of land transactions are involving corporates, sovereign wealth funds, etc. So these issues, I think, of people piling in to land, we're seeing elsewhere in the world, and of course with the reciprocal kind of rise in land values accordingly. Okay, well we'll come back to that as the show goes on. Now, next up, you've got Sue Pritchard, who's the CEO of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. Really delighted to have you here with us today, Sue. The FFCC brings people together on climate, nature and health. And of course, Sue is also involved with the Royal Agricultural University, one of our RICS accredited universities, and we'll be having our rural conference next summer there, live again for the first time in 3 years, which we're very, very happy about. But of course, I think importantly, Sue is on the front line of this. You also have an organic farm in Wales, Sue, so you've got the soil under your fingertips. and
Yes,
you know and you know what's going on live. So you're right in the front line of these, what can seem sometimes esoteric policy issues, and you can see what's happening on the ground. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And of course, reminding the audience, if you do have any questions for any of the panelists and speakers, do put them into the chat and we'll get to you as the Q&A goes on. But without further ado, I'll just hand over to Sue. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, James. And it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about a topic that, as James says, has been really close to my heart, not just for the time that I've been working at FFCC, but well, for a lot longer. I'll just give you a quick bit of background about FFCC. We were established in 2017 by a group of business and NGO leaders who realised that exiting the European Union was going to have huge issues for food, farming, land use, countryside, environment. And so we were set up as an independent inquiry to help shape a more sustainable, a more fair future for food and farming, for rural economies, for the countryside, and to develop that new version of the future in such a way that brought in a wider range of voices, often the seldom heard voices, into those conversations. So we've been working on this now since 2017. There are lots of people, I am sure, on this call and indeed on the panel who've been working in this space for a long time. And you will know, they know, and we found out really quickly when we started the Commission's work back in 2017, that land use, but perhaps more specifically, land use decision making was at the heart of some of the huge questions that we face. Now, Louise rattled through at the start all of the different issues that kind of locate on the land, including government policy aspirations. So things like net zero by 2050, 300,000 homes a year, 30,000 hectares of trees a year, restoring 75% of protected wildlife sites, 70% of farms, moving into the CAP replacement, the new sustainable farming initiative, and that's not to even mention for too long all of the kind of strategic infrastructure developments that are part of the UK's economic and social aspirations. But also there are lots of really important things that have not been properly explored or discussed, which are also reliant on land. Something that is extremely topical now is how much food should the UK aim to produce and where, both to improve our food security, but also perhaps taking more responsibility for growing more of the healthy food we need in a way that is suited to the ecological conditions of the UK. How much land should be devoted to energy, to BECCS, to solar, wind, and where should that go? And how sustainable does the UK want to be for timber? We have tree planting targets, but we haven't really got any strategic sense of what do we do with those trees once they've grown. So all of these questions and targets are a material reality now facing planners, farmers, landowners, land managers all around the country. But what we discovered really quickly when we were starting out this work at FFCC was that this can be a really tough topic, and probably why these big questions had been kind of put in the too hard box, kicked into the long grass for so long. But what we also found was that there was a growing recognition and a growing realization that we could not avoid facing into these issues any longer. We were going to have to grapple with some of the tricky and the contested issues that are centered on land and land use. One of the things that we found kind of unlocked some of that stickiness quite early was to talk about a land use framework rather than a plan or a strategy. Very often people judge that a strategy, a land use strategy, will be top down. It might be a bit Maoist, telling private owners what to do with their own assets. But that pushback, that abreaction, was elided somewhat when we talked about a framework for decision making, where we could build into that framework collaborative approaches, participatory approaches, engaging all of the multiple interests into the messiness of the decision making that we knew was the kind of material reality of what we had to do. So in developing a land use framework approach, we brought together people, organizations in partnerships to help kind of work through the real practical politics of making some progress on this. And the Geospatial Commission and Hamish in Scotland have been brilliant partners and supporters in the work that we've been developing, and we continue to partner in the kind of practical ways forward, which I'll say a little bit more about when I talk about the pilots that we're engaged in with the Geospatial Commission and others in Devon and Cambridge. But starting out from ways of working, so we agreed with our partners and with other stakeholders through a series of workshops and activities with others, what kind of ways of working become important in progressing the reality of this work. So we first of all talked about establishing leadership commitment, and that actually any land use framework or land use decision making does have to be backed by the senior institutional leaders across the whole system who are willing to work together to actually create and hold the right conditions for this tough work to happen. So some of that is about agreeing goals. It's about convening the system. It's about holding people in the room together to work through some of those tough challenges where we are kind of mediating, negotiating land use choices in places around the country. We agreed that it needs to be transparent and inclusive, so involving multiple stakeholders, appropriate to the scale of the problem, in a genuinely inclusive and participative process. It has to be evidence-based, informed by the evidence that we have, but also recognizing that we only generate evidence when we ask the right questions. So sometimes the critical interrogation of the evidence that we have reveals for us all of the really important things for which we don't have good evidence. So evidence-based needs to be both grounded in what is, but also critically aware of what we don't have yet. And that's why some of the work that the Geospatial Commission is doing right now on both amalgamating data sets, but also recognizing where data isn't easily available. And that's so important, because we need to be able to work into a future, much of which we don't yet know. We don't know what we're going to have to be dealing with. We've got increasing amounts of evidence that suggests to us what we're going to have to be working with. But when we're working into such complex future scenarios, we need to be thinking in a very kind of action researchy, iterative way. So we also talked about it being integrative, that it needs to work across the nation's targets and the needs and aspirations of land, both those that already have targets, but those that don't, that I mentioned earlier. So thinking about not just spatial goals, but temporal goals, goals that we project into the future in time. So how do we make progress on those sticky issues, setting up short-term milestones as well as long-term aims? And that means it needs to be both strategic, but also really granular. How is this going to work on the ground in the material reality of landscape, of land, of soil, of catchments, of human settlements and people's lived experience? So we find that often a lot can be learned from interrogating the kind of the granular and the specific, and then extrapolate out of that into the big strategic as well. So it's a kind of way of integrating top down and bottom up. And of course, we need to learn from what works. Our land use framework, it's still being iterated. So although we've got some diagrammatic representations, and I can drop into the chat links to our land use framework hub on our website at ffcc.co.uk. Our principles are that it needs to be land-led, it needs to be able to be adaptive and resilient, locally responsive, outward and future focused, needs to perhaps crucially be multifunctional and contributing prosperity to improve public value. Now, as I said earlier, we've been developing this work through a whole range of strategic and practical partnerships. And some of those practical partnerships have been in places in our regional inquiries around the UK. So one of the ways that FFCC has worked from the start is both at a UK level, but also working more deeply in places in Wales, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and then in our 3 places in England, in Devon, in Cambridgeshire, and in Cumbria, where we have spent time in those places with local leadership, local communities, local groups, to kind of really understand the granularity and the materiality of big strategic decisions on people's lived experience and place. And when we were conducting our inquiry through 2018, 2019, before our report where we first recommended the development of a land use framework, it was Devon initially, and then Cambridgeshire separately, that asked us to pilot some of the work, some of the thinking in those places. And the leadership that we were working with in both of those places was saying to us, we want to work through in a process of action research and collaborative inquiry what this really looks like and feels like on the ground, in place, on the real world issues that we're having to deal with. So in Devon, we've been picking up particularly issues around flooding and land use, and funded by the Environment Agency, Geospatial Commission, and our own core funders, Esme Fairbairn Foundation. So we've been bringing groups of community, professional, technical, statutory stakeholders around all of the questions that are raised when we think about water and flooding, both now, but also in the future, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, in all of the kinds of climate scenarios that might unfold. Similarly, in Cambridgeshire, questions of water are pretty important there. That's the hub of growing in the UK. It's one of the places where lots of our vegetables and horticulture takes place. But also, as groups pointed out to us when we did our first exercise in Cambridgeshire with the local community and stakeholders there, we went very old school. We had lots of people around lots of tables with very, very big maps. And we said, here's some coloured pens, draw on these maps where you think the really critical issues are for Cambridgeshire when we're thinking about land use and land use decision makings. And more than half of the tables just took a big blue pen and coloured the whole county in blue and said, if we don't sort out some really, really serious issues around the climate risk, climate change, and flood mitigation, this whole area will be flooded. We will not be able to manage flood risks in this place, which is, pretty, it kind of, slows you down a bit in thinking how very serious those sorts of issues are. These are issues that you're dealing with all of the time. But one of the things that we have been really, really excited about in our work in the pilots is discovering just how enthusiastic citizens are in joining these conversations. Now, very often, professionals can be anxious about really engaging citizens and communities in these really complex decisions, because they think people are going to ask for what they can't have. We don't have the resources to meet everybody's needs. People are NIMBYs. They don't want difficult things happening in their localities. NIMBYs is a UK phrase for not in my backyard. And so if we engage them, they're just going to tell us they don't want stuff rather than, you know, where they do want stuff. And that's going to be really tough. But that is not what we found. So as we've been working with citizens groups, through local partners, in all sorts of places, both in Cambridgeshire and in Devon, and actually in other places in the UK where we work too, we have found that the local appetite, the citizen appetite for developing a land use framework is strong. People across all sorts of sectors, farmers, land managers, campaign groups, housing groups and so on, could see the need and were really frustrated at being the victims of poor land use decisions. Rather than wanting to kind of stop them. And they're really, really keen to see what you could argue is a long-standing division between land management, environmental land management, and planning, the planning system, that divide bridged more effectively. People were really keen to understand more about the strategic as well as the local prospects for thinking through land use framework, but it also demonstrated how it could unlock different ways of thinking and better use of information and data and expertise to really enrich the way that decisions are currently made. So even in the kind of small scale citizen engagement pieces of work that we've been doing thus far on this, people relish having more information, more data, and they really rise to the challenge of that. So it's very exciting, and it has, of course, the potential to reveal, as I was saying earlier, the gaps in the data, not just where data already exists, where it doesn't exist. And a phrase I use quite often, whose evidence counts? Again, very often citizens' evidence is kind of dismissed as anecdote or you know, not scientifically robust. And yet, of course, it can be the most material information in knowing how, you know, knowing what works in a really material way in place, and without really harvesting that evidence, that material, we can end up with a massive gap in the quality of the decision making. So that's been incredibly encouraging for us. We're in the middle of those pilots at the moment. The citizen participation, institutional participation is really encouraging, and I think demonstrating that people recognise that this is, you know, this is the time. We can't go on without tackling these tricky issues anymore, and we want to do it in a way that is rigorous, that's robust, that's inclusive, that's transparent, that's open. I'm just going to say a couple of things about the House of Lords report. Now, I don't have any inside track on this, but I suppose we have been enthusiastically trying to grab bits of data where we have heard things to get excited or not about the House of Lords inquiry on land use that is coming out next week. And what we think it's going to say, having done a really robust piece of work, I think, over the last year, I'm actually really very excited about. I'm really feeling very positive about it. So I think the Lords inquiry is going to say there is a strong case for a land use framework, and many of you will know that UK government has committed to producing a land use framework as part of its response to the National Food Strategy. But importantly, I think the Lords inquiry is likely to say a land use framework can't just be DEFRA owned. It has to facilitate much better decisions on land between all the material departments, the relevant departments, and that includes, of course, DLUC in the planning system. It has to include BEIS. It crucially has to involve Treasury. We talk a lot about the public value of land and how decisions on land have to have to add to public value and not deplete public value as they very often do. I think the Lord's inquiry might well say that a land use framework can, if designed correctly, facilitate much better quality decisions across different spatial scales, from top down, the middle level, that kind of tricky middle, but also at the local scale. And I think they're going to come down on the side of multifunctionality and land sharing, recognizing that to meet all of the aspirations that we have of land in the UK, we need probably 3 Englands. And therefore we have to be able to work through and negotiate multifunctional land use across the whole of the landscape on a continuum of approaches, recognizing that we need to restore and recover nature very rapidly in some places. In others, we may need to be intensifying certain sorts of activities. Anyway, that's a sneaky peek. James has appeared, so that's my time done. We can crack on with some questions.
Just like the panto villain coming on there at the end to stop you mid-flow, Sue. And thanks for the insight into that House of Lords report. I think that's very positive, you know, to see that they're moving towards that multifunctional kind of view of land, I think. And could I ask the Hamish and Louise to come back on? We've had a couple of questions come in, and we can start off from there. It reminds me of what Hamish actually said when he was speaking about people's renewed interest in land issues, particularly from the public. I think, and you've mentioned it there as well, I think I've often felt, or many people did, that, you know, land went off the political agenda really, certainly during the 80s and 90s and noughties, but now has become a much bigger issue for a lot more people. Maybe that's due to COVID and people wanting access to the countryside and actually becoming much more aware of what's going on around them. But Louise, if I could just go back to you quickly. You mentioned that slide about that seminal report on land use futures from 2010, I think it was. What have you seen change in relation to many of those recommendations in that report, do you think, over the last basically 12 years? And is it still as relevant now as it was then?
Okay, yes, it's relevant, and it's relevant because it tried to touch all the bases in rather like the way that Sue's described. There are parts of it that are not relevant though, because things have moved on, and I think where things have moved on most encouragingly is a willingness to share data in a way that wasn't present then, and an ability to make that data shareable that wasn't available then. So that interoperability that was a real sticking point doesn't exist to the same extent now in a sense. So I think we've got some big opportunities there. I also think that at that time there was interest in land use. It was clear that different government departments were thinking differently, but it was sort of communicated in a it's too complex to solve it way, rather than let's look for where we can make small opportunities work for us. And the multifaceted bit just did not exist at all. And with my background's in diffuse environmental pollution, so trying to catch that pollution that you can't see, that comes from fields that you don't know how to track, and that has an impact through time and really changes systems in a big way. We've now got ways of measuring that we didn't have 12 years ago. So I think, you know, you've got the willingness to share, you've got the improvements in that interoperability, and we'll have some further improvements coming forward, which will be around the Earth observation and what you can do from a technical sense, which will mean there's probably a lot less ability to hide in a sense. So I think that that's both good and bad. Of course, it'd be bad for people who are trying to hide something, but it'll also be good in terms of trying to access data. But I think the other point I'd say is that around Sue's point around the sort of multifunctional elements, I think helps embrace the fact that not all farmers are bad. You know, there was very much the 12 years ago bit that, you know, farmers are, you know, not being responsible for the environment they farm on the whole, and responsible for causing many of those challenges. So that multifunctional element actually helps alleviate some of those challenges. And I think the other part is that more of an acceptance that, you know, if you're farming land, for example, you're looking for what used to be called pluriactivity, a word that I never really quite understand, but it still sticks in my brain. It means doing many things with the same land. But the fact that, you know, many farm businesses are now businesses using very different ways to make money. So you're trying to farm tourists as much as you're trying to farm land. That's one of the reasons why people are interested. And I think that that's really quite critical. The last bit I think is important is that a better integration between urban and rural. It's not good enough, but a better thinking about how those two areas integrate. And they are both siloed in the way government departments look at them, but siloed in the way we do research. So my natural home is the Natural Environment Research Council. I've been a council member for a number of years and just stepped down. But they tend to deal with the big land areas, whereas Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council tends to focus on engineered environments, the urban environment. And those, because we've got the formation of UK Research and Innovation, those boundaries between how we do research are starting to break down a little bit. And I think we're doing it in a much more integrated way. And, you know, because of the quality of the data we've got now, you can do that both at very fine scale resolution, but you can also do it up to global scale, thinking about those larger models. And that thinking's coming together in a way it hadn't before. So lots of things are still embedded, but lots of things have changed that give me hope that the friction points I started talking about when I spoke could actually be properly identified and maybe unblocked. And it's a bit like a gutter that's got blocked up with leaves, take them out of the way and suddenly everything sort of moves on. I'm hoping for a lot of that to happen.
Hamish, during your talk, you mentioned about the public interest test that's been ingrained into the legislation on land use within Scotland. Is that an indication of growing public interest in land use north of the border? And do you think that's transferable to England and Wales, for instance?
Yes, so I think you're right. I think the public interest test is one way of responding to basically the increased recognition and the increased interest actually that Sue referred to as well, around actually what are these big land use changes meaning more widely for the people who live in that area, for the wider regional scale, and of course for national targets. So we're very conscious in Scotland that we have some very large land holdings, and they, you know, it's open to any individual, anyone to come and buy land in Scotland. Nothing wrong with that, but it's open to anyone to buy as much land as they want in Scotland. And essentially, the public interest test proposal is saying, well, if that is the case, it's reasonable actually just to have some checks and balances, given the wide range of interests and implications that could result from this. Let's have the checks and balances there around both the impacts of concentrated power in terms of large landholdings and communities, but also in terms of net zero and national objectives. So yeah, I think it is about introducing a kind of the checks and balances within the system that recognises the wider public interest in our land. And just briefly picking up on the point Louise raised about rural-urban connections. I mean, you asked if it's transferable. I think yes, in different forms it is. And you know, one of the interesting things we see are very similar issues in an urban context. They play out very differently, but actually the underlying drivers around control, transparency, accessibility, availability of land are remarkably similar across rural and urban contexts.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm sure you've seen that in your pilot areas as well, Sue, this increase in public interest like you'd mentioned, and the way people are becoming much more aware of land use issues and the potential effects on them and their communities.
Absolutely. I mean, it shows up in very particular ways through flooding and drought, and you know, that has a huge impact on people's lives and futures. But I'm also noticing an interest in kind of blurring the boundaries between urban and rural, as Louise was saying earlier, Hamish too. So there's an enormous amount of interest in greening cities, you know, bringing nature into urban settings, and thinking more about what a sustainable rural community can look like, when so much of the nation's aspirations now are centered on what happens on the rural landscape. You know, that's where carbon's going to be sequestered. It's where nature's going to be restored. So that sense of the deep relationship and interconnection between people who choose an urban life and people who choose a rural or a peri-urban life, or a kind of market town life. All sorts of gradations, aren't there, between the two? I think we are seeing ourselves really kind of embedded in each other's futures more than perhaps we have in the past. There is much more to do. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, because yeah, there is much more to do, but I'm feeling optimistic that we have a deeper sense of the relationships and the connections which emanate from how we use our land in different places in ways that meet all of our needs.
No, and I think what you mentioned during the talk as well, that for us to be able to pick up that tab from the carbon heavy built environment, we need 3 times the land mass. And I think that's something that people need to be aware of, that balance between the rural and urban environments. Now, my colleague Fiona Mannix, who's a rural expert and land expert in RICS, wouldn't forgive me if I didn't mention our woodlands, the evaluation of woodlands guidance that we're currently consulting on. There's a particular focus on natural capital. And Hamish, I know that natural capital is a major part of what the Scottish Land Commission is thinking about, and of course how carbon markets are working. What's your experience at the moment of how these nascent markets are working, and what are the pinch points of difficulties you think that are affecting them?
Briefly, it is emerging as a major driver of both ownership and land use decisions in Scotland. We're seeing land changing hands specifically for natural carbon kind of motivations. We're seeing land use decisions and management decisions being based around that. What's unclear is we're also seeing, by the way, huge price rises, so huge increases in land value in Scotland associated with this. What's unclear amongst all land agents as well, it seems, is whether that's a bubble, and if it is, how long will it be before it bursts, and what are the long-term liabilities? We don't know yet, to be honest, but we don't see that changing anytime soon. So we think prices are remaining at that kind of high level. So yeah, it raises questions around risk of greenwashing and enough clarity in terms of, are we actually offsetting in a sensible way? It raises questions around access and availability of land and pricing. And it raises questions about land use change and the decision-making process, I think.
Yeah, and it's very much an emerging area, and we can see that, like I mentioned, globally as well. I'm sure many of our colleagues from different nations will note that, you know, and it's something that many organisations are aware of, that rise in land value that's been caused by kind of natural capital and carbon kind of investment. I think it's something that is very much on our dashboard at the moment. We've had a couple of questions in. One of them is focused on the delivery of housing, probably particularly affordable housing. We've all been aware of what's happened over the last few days and the removal of government housing targets by the Secretary of State. Louise, the Geospatial Commission and the data that you're putting together on land use data, where do you see that kind of fitting into helping with that provision of appropriate housing in rural or peri-urban areas?
I think from my perspective, and you know, the Commission's perspective, is it's not about saying you can't have it, it's about where's best to place it, and that won't necessarily align with where we've got land banks being held by companies ready to build those houses. Now, I say that in the context of we're pretty clear now, because the evidence says don't build on floodplains, but there are other areas where, you know, if you actually moved what you were trying to do to a different location, you get that multifunctionality in a positive, versus if you put it in another area, you might have multifunctionality in a negative. So I think we probably need to start thinking a little bit more about where can you actually put housing developments that add value in a way and don't actually have a detrimental effect, whereas I tend to think we're always retrofitting to something that's already been committed because the land banks exist, and that's not the right way to do it. I have no idea how we get around that, but it does seem to me that that's not a good place to start from, other than by articulating that it doesn't necessarily help.
I think that the housing issues, particularly in land use, we could have a whole separate webinar on.
It should be good.
That.
Yes.
It would be good, wouldn't it? I think we should follow on with one of those. And I'll leave the last word to Fiona. Put up a question: is can the rest of the UK follow Scotland's lead, Hamish, and implement some of the land use legislation that you've enacted up there?
Well, of course, I think that's a good idea, and to do it in absolutely your own way. And there are lessons to be learned across all UK nations, actually, which is one of the great things here. But you know, briefly, the Parliament set up the Land Commission partly to move on from a stop-start focus on land at parliamentary level, and in a way, that's possibly the single biggest advantage of it.
And hopefully, as you said, Sue, this House of Lords report on the land use framework and its necessity and that multifunctionality will be a bit of a kickstart to potential legislative change in England and Wales and Ireland as well. And I think we're just coming up to the top of the hour. I really want to thank the three of you for a fantastically insightful and heavyweight webinar. You know, there's some really great stuff there, and I hope that everybody online has really taken something away from it and really enjoyed the last hour. Of course, we're also going to be doing WebF into the new year, so do keep your eyes open for that, and I'm sure we'll be following on with various other webinars as we come towards that date in January. I'm just looking up there. So it just remains me to thank in the traditional manner, of course, Sue and Hamish and Louise for all their input and their expert views today on today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Pleasure.